household as the measure of women's empowerment. So that's the category they say you want to look at for women's empowerment. They don't think about female labor supply as a measure of women's empowerment. In fact, female labor supply is not measured in 4 out of the 6 studies. So 4 out of the 6 studies only measure total household supply. Out of the 2 studies that do look at female labor supply, you find a significant effect in one. But if you try to start piecing together what's happening in these studies, if you take the example of the India study, what you see in the Spandana study is that total household labor supply went up, and it went up through self-employment activities, which possibly reflected that women worked more. There was also a significant increase in the number of new self-employment activities managed by women. At the same time, it's certainly true that self-reported measures of decision-making didn't change. And I think it's an important point to remember that social norms don't just affect actions, and sometimes they also affect how we describe actions. There are many cases where we know the things that move last are self-reports of what you think the norm is. So again, I think if we want to take these evaluations seriously, we need to think a lot more about what are the economic activities that we think will be first moved, and then try to find evidence on those. Okay. So kind of along those veins, what I wanted to do in the remainder of the time I had is to turn to talking about one field experiment that I and colleagues are in the middle of doing, where we try to think a little bit more about how actually you can potentially think about labor supply decisions and what the role of financial inclusion would be. And I think a relevant context for doing that in India right now is there's a lot of excitement in moving towards direct benefit transfers for a number of programs. So you see a lot of rise in DBT programs. It could be for LPG or it could be for fertilizer. But interestingly, when you hear about these DBT programs, you don't hear in the press, and I don't know, maybe in the policy circles there's a bit more, but certainly not in what I've read, discussion about how you should be designing these DBTs. So there is, again, a kind of a disjunction between what we know on the ground of the household dynamics and this idea that the household is a single person when we're talking about direct benefit transfer programs in India. And so one thing we were interested in was to ask, will it matter if you try to change how targeting of these programs work? An important reason for doing that, of course, is that we know from the conditional cash transfer literature that it appears to have significant effects in economic behavior when you provide conditionality. There's a lot more mixed evidence on whether it actually affects differently for men and women, so it's actually to some extent an open question. So what we did is we worked in the context of India's largest social protection program that takes a large share of its GDP, which is the NREGA program that guarantees 100 days of minimum work at a fixed wage. So the interesting thing about this program, of course, is that this guarantee is provided not at the individual level, but the household level, right? So you can see that immediately this is something where there's going to be some household decision making that takes place in take-up of this program. The program also moved, it was one of the earliest movers in terms of electronic payouts. So it moved from a cash payout system to electronic benefits transfer in 2008. And as of 2016, it was made mandatory that you're going to have payment into a bank account. So the work we've been doing in Madhya Pradesh, but I would say Madhya Pradesh is not atypical of the country, that most households link a single bank account to the NREGA payments. So the way it works is at the point at which you get a job card as a household, which is the basic documentation that gives you access, you're going to, the job card lists the name of all the adult members who will be eligible to work, and you kind of provide a bank account for them. And the default has been to provide a single bank account. And so as a result, women's wages are, and this tends to typically be the household head or the male, so women's wages are typically paid into the husband's account. And when you talk to policy people, what they would say, which seems very reasonable, is that especially in a setting with high mobility constraints, it's not clear that it's going to be very useful to tie it to a woman's account, like to have basically your wage turning up into your individual account. There are lots of reasons to believe that these women may not be able to access the bank, and you saw the IHDS data that shows that that's certainly on average true. It could also be that they are financially, they have given up control of most actions to their husbands, and so this is just the most efficient thing to do. So we weren't so sure, and so we decided to try to work with the state government in Madhya Pradesh to ask this question of, can you see change if you make sure that a worker's wages go into its individual account? And like with everything, many things I do, what you find is that this actually existed as law. So the law was that you were supposed to, or law or executive order, was that you were supposed to pay wages into an individual account. So it was just a case of saying, let's implement on the ground something that actually exists as an executive order. So we worked with the government of Madhya Pradesh and 2 large public sector banks in the region. And we chose, and expose, there's always good and bad reasons. What we chose to do is we actually purposively chose the 4 districts in Madhya Pradesh that had the lowest sex ratios. We wanted to look at areas which were particularly perverse for women. I'm not sure that had other issues as well, but just to give you a sense, the male to female sex ratios in the 4 districts were between 1.1 to 1.2, and its average matches that of Haryana, which is the worst state in India right now. We then did a full census to identify a set of married couples where they were officially listed as having worked in NREGA, so they had worked in the last year, and at least one of the 2 spouses reported that they had ever worked, and the wife does not have a bank account. And so this was the sample we started with. We then, let me actually move here. I think it's going to be easier to talk from this. I'll go back if you will. So the first thing you want to do is recognize the fact that financial inclusion can itself have effects on women's economic activity and women's empowerment. So we realized that we're going to at least need to have 2 different things to test. One is whether just opening a bank account matters, and the other is if you open the bank account and then link a woman's NREGA wages to that. So that sort of is the account basic, and the account basic linking is in the first one, so these are all randomized into these groups. In the account basic, we just opened a bank account for the woman, and in the account plus linking, we asked the woman if she would like her account linked, and if it did, we worked with the district authorities to get that done. We were then in the field a year and a half ago, and we realized that while the RBI had put in place quite a strong financial inclusion program around the time of bank account opening, this was actually not happening. So you could open a bank account and the person has in some sense no information about the bank account. So we decided to cross-cut into it. In some sense, what we just think of is the kind of basic class that I'm told in the US kids get at the age of 12 of, this is what opening a bank account is like, this is what you should think about for financial management. But really all it involved was telling people, this is a bank account, this is what a CSP card looks like, this is how you deposit 50 rupees, this is how you take out 50 rupees. So that's the universe at which we looked at. So what I wanted to do was just go through the basic set of findings that we have from this. We used 2 different sources of data. Our implementation took us quite a while, so we have a survey, a midline survey that we conducted roughly 5 or 6 months after the intervention was implemented, and that was around this time last year. So it went from November 2015 to January 2016. We then have 2 sources of administrative data, which is the transactions data from one of our partner banks, which sort of shows us what's happening in the banks. And we have some data from the NREGA administrative services. And that is roughly more recent, that we got from September 2016 was our last pull of the data. So that's roughly a year since that's happened. So this is data simply from the survey, and what you see is that unsurprisingly all these interventions that focused on opening accounts were reasonably successful. So again, remember this is all, you ask someone if they want an account open, so the reason this is not 100% is because the person might say, no, I don't want another account. But when we do the results, we basically simply measure which group you were assigned to, not the outcome there. The next thing we look at is whether you were more likely to go to the bank. And here what we see is, we see that the only 2 groups where we see a significant effect compared to the control So just to remind you, the control is the group where we did nothing. So you should think about the control as the group where nothing happened. And what we're doing is we're comparing it across the others. In all cases, what we were interested in is comparing the effect of linking relative to the case where you just opened a bank account for the woman. So the dotted line in all of these cases reflects the coefficient on when I just opened a bank account, because just opening a bank account could have an effect. And then these whiskers in some sense show you whether the effect for either linking alone or linking with training or just providing a bit of training in addition to opening the bank has a differential effect. So think about we're estimating impacts relative to just having done financial inclusion. And so what you see is that when it comes to opening a bank account, there's no differential effect. We're as likely to open a bank account when we open a bank account than when we link it. On the other hand, when we look at whether you've been to a bank, you definitely see that a bank account where there was a bit of training, you see an increase, and you see some increase also when you've linked. Yeah. The next thing, this is from the administrative data. And this shows you what is actually happening in these bank accounts. And what you see here, which is important, is these are kind of 2-hour implementation windows, but basically after we complete our final implementation, you see a huge shoot up in the deposits in these bank accounts from NREGA for the group that had linked accounts. But importantly, what's true is that because in these transactions data, there's actually a little identifier for an NREGA deposit, we can look at the rest, which we know are not NREGA deposits. Those also seem to go up. So we see a significant increase in the usage of these bank accounts, just in terms of money hitting it. They're not saving a lot in it, but they're receiving a lot more money in those accounts, which suggests that that might have to do with working more. So the next thing we look at is what happens to work. So we can look at it in just the administrative data of the NREGA account. We see a significant increase that the people in the linking group were more likely to work. We don't see significant effects in the other groups. So even though those look higher, you can see the standard errors are not different from the dotted line. And then what you can see is, because I'm slightly short of time, is in your self-report of what your main occupation is. So we followed the NSS classification. So in the NSS classification, they ask for your principal occupation code. And I think this is something I really like, is that women change how they perceive themselves. You see a significant decline that a woman reports herself as a housewife and reports her principal occupation to be a worker. And interestingly, we find this change when we look at either the female report or the male report in the household. We also find that women are more likely to have worked in the last year. And just to give you a sense of the numbers, when we look at this, it's roughly 25% increase in the wages that women receive. And you're going to run short of time, so let me just summarize a couple of the other results that we have found till now. We find increases in mobility that go alongside, so women are more likely to report that they go alone out of the house. We don't find changes right now in in domestic violence or decision making. So I think that's, again, this idea that there is a set of things that move first, and then it takes a while for it to change. The other thing that we find is that these effects are concentrated among the group that did not work at baseline. So we look at it 2 ways. So if you look at the women who didn't work at baseline in NREGA at all, that's the place where we see these effects. And we also see it more pronounced in the groups where men have stronger norms about women working. And both of these are suggestive that the channel that is going through is bargaining power. So you can imagine if I'm a woman who has already negotiated with my husband to be in the workforce, this may have a little additional effect. While if I start by being a woman who has not been able to negotiate by being in the workforce, this adds to it. One of the things we're going to the field in January, and if people have feedback, we'd love to hear more, is to actually try to get more nuanced understandings of exactly what the nature of the change in bargaining power is, and potentially also whether there are any changes in norms. But let me just conclude with what I sort of see as some of the learnings from this sort of broader literature on labor supply. I think a lot of kind of gender empowerment policies, especially in India, have focused I think, all 3 stages. So there's the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao campaigns, which either focus on directly trying to reduce skewed sex ratios or educate girls. And then there are a lot of schemes aimed at maternal health, so Janani Suraksha Yojanas. If you look across the span, there are very few schemes that actually think of women as workers. I think I find it very hard to think of any. I think the skills training is probably the closest I can think right now of schemes that have quotas for women in it. I think we've also seen, and there was work yesterday that Shabana and Kale, for instance, presented that suggested that increasing education in some sense doesn't seem to be enough to provide women mobility. And if you're not seeing them get mobility, what you're seeing is a lot more educated women sort of sitting around getting bored for a year or 2 before they enter marriage. And I think that's, in some sense, we need to slightly move the policy focus to start thinking a little bit more about job creation for young women. And if you particularly think that job creation for young women has a set of externalities in terms of sex ratios or in terms of household outcomes, there may even be an argument for slightly prioritizing job creation for women over men. And I think this is a particularly important thing to keep in mind in India right now, because as it thinks about the demographic dividend and thinks about potential deindustrialization coming down its way, it's a very natural compulsion to say the men need to get the job first. But I think there are a lot of reasons we see why job creations that are focused on women may be successful on many dimensions, but I think for them to succeed, you would need to think a lot harder about what are the kind of policy levers that are actually going to change bargaining power. So let me stop there. Thank you.